This video is for my women again, my feminine forces out there. This one can be universally applied, so if you feel like it resonates with you, take it anyway, even if you're not a woman. I want to speak about the importance of sexual education, especially for young women, and how it can prevent a lot of tragedy, because statistically speaking, as I've said in other videos, a lot of the world's darkest atrocities of abuse of sexual power particularly targets women and children. Both as adults and children, women tend to have a greater number and tend to be at greater risk for these sorts of things, although obviously I'm not going to leave out the fact that it is happening to our entire population and anybody could be a victim of this sort of thing. But I do want to bring a particular focus to women in this video because we are at higher risk in young women and young girls, and why it's important to have proper age-related and age-appropriate education on our bodies, whether it has to do with sex specifically or just what our bodies are doing through puberty and things like that, and how that is pivotal to a woman's safety, and how sexual education at the appropriate age is also imperative to a woman's safety. And then as far as the practical knowledge and book smart knowledge of dating culture and men's habits and men's sexuality and men's current paradigms around sex are extremely important for the woman to know. Again, everybody can be a victim, and I will never say that this only applies to the group that I'm speaking to or intending to speak to, but I am going to go ahead and speak to the group in which has been the largest victimized population historically, because when you're treating a problem, you can get the bulk of it out of the way by addressing the largest afflicted population. So that's what I'm going to go for, because the current paradigm is still heavily and it is going away. We definitely see declining figures in men and boys who think this way, and despite what media is going to tell you, we are headed in the right direction. And just in general, human evolution is inevitable, change is inevitable, and the slow gravitation, in the colloquial phrase, all paths lead home, is inevitable. So ultimately, we should never be worried about the trajectory of any of this stuff, because a long enough time span will always dictate that change and evolution is necessary. But how we can aid in that journey as a body of women and as a body of young girls is by educating ourselves, so that we can establish proper boundaries and enact certain safeties to our body, our mindset, our emotions, our time, and our spiritual well-being against the sort of atrocities that we're trying to overcome as a body of mankind. So statistically speaking, a lot of sexual abuse is aimed at young girls and young women, and I would say women under 40 for the most part. It's going to be that as an average population. But again, if this message resonates with you at all, accept it, integrate it, use it, because overall it's going to apply to everybody, even the men who desire to protect themselves and protect us and protect their children and whatever it is. So it is still a universal message, and I will never leave anybody out of the discussion. That being said, I'm going to preface this entire thing by starting with the definition, or my definition, of rape culture, and the fact that it is actually a thing. And this is a huge reason of why young girls and young women need to be prepared for this sort of thing. So we would not have this type of reported statistics that we have, and have so many shared stories in women's circles and circles of young girls, relating to the victimization of their sexuality in some way, shape, or form, if it was not such a prevalent thing. So that in and of itself is enough to justify the argument, although I am going to provide plenty of more reasoning and evidence. But the evidence that this is happening so prevalently, even though we try to deny its existence, is enough to prove that it is real and that vulnerable populations are being manipulated. So rape, in my definition, we have our dictionary and our cultural or pop culture definitions, but what I truly believe rape is the coercion into any type of sexual behavior. And I use the term coercion because that can include manipulation, including mental or emotional manipulation, because an informed individual is the individual who can give consent. This is exactly why we talk about this when it comes to age gaps, or when we talk about psychological experiments that are done, social experiments that are done. Consent is based around the fact that somebody is, one, old enough to consent, which most of us know, but two, informed enough to consent, and then three, of sound mind. This is exactly why we don't, for example, give guns to people who have certain mental disorders, or why certain mental disorders can disqualify you from certain activities because you are deemed unsafe or unfit to make that particular decision. So that being said, coercion includes the game making of somebody's mind or situation or emotionality to influence that behavior, because at that point you're not truly informed or of sound mind once you're making that decision. So I believe that rape culture extends beyond brutal acts and brutal coercion or violent coercion, right? I truly believe, and I think this is something that as we move along, we're going to become more aware to the fact that we're doing, because most problems don't emerge because we finally say that, oh, this is happening now, or this is happening recently. A lot of the time when we treat a problem, it's the awareness that, oh, we've been doing this for a really long time and justifying it with X, Y, and Z, or living in the paradigm of X, Y, and Z. So it's just taking out a layer of false consciousness of something that we've been doing since the dawn of time, or for centuries, or for years, or for decades, or whatever it is. So a lot of the time it's an unveiling of something that has pervaded through a timeline. So it's always been a part of our consciousness, but we haven't been aware or been willingly aware of it. So in the term of rape culture, it is a real thing. And I think as we move down the timeline, we're going to understand that rape extends beyond violent coercion and the actual taking of somebody's body, because we don't consider the effects of that type of trauma to necessarily be something physical, although that is a factor that plays into it, especially, obviously, the more brutal something has been done to you, you're going to need body healing just as much as your spiritual, emotional, and mental healing. But the majority of the type of healing we concentrate on tends to revolve around the first three that I stated, because treating the body is one layer. And once we get that out of the way, we get to the meat or the real problem that is going to affect us for a larger span of time for the average individual. Of course, there are exceptions to that rule, and I have full respect for that, and I encourage people to speak on that because it is not an absolute. But in general, the main effects of this trauma are spiritual, mental, and emotional, and it's because so much spiritual, mental, and emotional manipulation occurs in order to get somebody into that act, and also occurs during the act, after the act, in the mind of the individual. So things that were inflicted upon that individual become internalized and become a part of that individual for a while until the healing process takes place. So the majority of what any atrocity tends to cause is what happens in the psyche and what happens in the perception of the individual going forward. And the meat of pain and suffering tends to lie there, as opposed to the physical suffering that we've gotten through. That being said, when it comes to rape culture, rape also requires, by default, the rape of the mind, the rape of the spirituality, and the rape of the emotions of that individual because of the lasting effects of trauma, and does not specifically only relate to the rape of the physical body or the misuse or the desired intent to misuse the body of another person. So, that being the definition, that extends into casual dating culture as well. It also extends into the player mindset, which is a subsection of rape, which is why I find it to be so absolutely deplorable as an individual. That is my opinion. And the reason that is because it is the same type of tool that is used to coerce sexual prowess or sexual power over somebody else, and in its seed form it is essentially the same thing as rape. So the seriousness of what is happening in our dating culture as we become more and more degenerate about sexuality is the pervasiveness and the expansion of rape culture, which, again, relating this back to safety and boundaries and the preservation of women and children and other vulnerable populations that suffer from these types of atrocities, being informed about dating and dating manipulation is actually a matter of safety. And this is why in the spheres between men and women and a lot of the main conflicts that we're discussing today in pop culture and media and within our private spheres revolve heavily around how do I create safety again, and revolve heavily around talking about emotional intelligence and emotional safety and boundaries and all that. Why is that discussion so popular right now? It's because we're losing sight of the base ability to keep ourselves safe sexually and to keep other people around us safe sexually, and to, as the aggressor in these situations, whether conscious or unconscious, be a sexually, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally safe person to be around. In the case of women and young girls, because historically speaking, men have had power, particularly white men have had power over this situation, you want to understand quite a few things. You want to understand, again, the sexual education when it is appropriate for your age, of your body, of a man's body, a developing